All right. Good afternoon and welcome back. We are from Idaho State University in Pocatello, Idaho. This project and presentation was done by the ISU Survey Club. Now, as to the team, we decided it would be a great idea to use kind of the crew chief and crew format for applying this project because we are a small crew and it was very important to differentiate our specific roles. However, having that being said, there was a high amount of collaboration throughout the entirety of this project. There was no decision done with one person. Everybody talked, everybody discussed, but we did have our crew set up. Elise DeBert was our crew chief and analyst. She's also the president of the ISU Survey Club and has had experience working with the calculations both in school and at work. And Corey Schofield is our instrument operator and analyst, and he also is our resident Eagle Scout, ergo we knew something about the compass, which was through a few screwballs to us. But he was also able to help Elise in the office with the calculations, Elise being the primary calculator, and Corey helping out and making sure everything flowed correctly. Valeria is our chainman and drafter, and she has drafted both in school and in work in Boise. So she has experience with several different types of drafting and also kind of helps streamline the field and making sure we could get everything done. Myself, Trevor Robinson, I'm the chainman, rodman analyst. So helping primarily with the chains, and then when we switched to topo, I was rodman and analyst. While these guys were calculating and drafting, I was putting together the methodology for this discussion. As a special note, we wanted to give a thanks to Darren Leavitt, who is our advisor for teaching us a lot of what we know and for helping get us here. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Corey to discuss our methodology.
All right, thanks, Trevor. So we're going to begin discussing our field methodology here. So the night before, we met together to clearly define our roles and what they would be out in the field. So as Trevor pointed out, we had our crew chief, who was also our field note taker, myself on the instrument, and Trevor and Valeria running the chain and the rods out there. Next, our boundary strategy. The night before, we decided that we would work from the center point as it was a known point and then set radial shots from there. We decided to use triangles, Pythagorean theorem, to calculate where those points should be laid out. We also decided that we would be working with azimuths instead of the bearings. That way we could quickly go from our azimuth and dial it into our compass, which read 360 degrees, and reduce our error in any blunders from that point. Once those points were calculated, we then, our method was to use chain and compass. We would plan to use the chain to measure out our distance, and we would rely on our compass to measure out our angles from that point. And we also plan to use Stadia to check chain and compass from that point. In our discussion and in our planning the night before, we heavily discussed our magnetic declination and how that would affect our field work. And in the project details we were given that our declination was 11 degrees, 42 minutes, plus or minus 20 minutes east in this location. Now our compass could only read to the nearest second degree. We could fine-tune that by splitting the degree marks and get into the nearest 1 degree, but that still left us without being able to finely tune the magnetic declination to the minute. So we decided that we would we would adjust to 12 degrees because 12 degrees declination fell within the plus or minus 20 minutes of error that we were given. So our grid strategy is fairly straightforward. We started from our northeast corner and then measured along the perimeter to set the grid, and we would then we plan to push our error and unequal intervals to the west and south line. Now moving on to our office strategy, again, it's fairly simple. The night before coming to the office, we divvied out and the division of our office tasks. We decided that Elise and I would be running calculations, Valeria would be running the draft work, and Trevor would be preparing our outline and reviewing our methodology, is what we planned for that. And then from there, we planned to run our calculations first, and then move on to drafting our final map. So with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Elise, who's going to talk about our application of that plan.
Thanks, Brian. So I'm going to discuss what actually happened out in the field versus what we had planned. So the first thing is that we established midpoints from our center. And we chose to do this for two purposes. One, we wanted to practice with our chain and compass and make sure that we were on. So we set those line points on the perimeters on each side. This also allowed us to have confidence in using our compass and setting our chains. They did show that we were visually checking on those boundaries. The next thing that we did is radially set the actual corners. So again, we went from the center, radially out, diagonally, and set from that known point. We did do 2 measurements off there, so we measured from the center out, and then we also measured from the point that we had set back, creating redundancy there. We then had the plan of checking with Stadia. This didn't go as planned. We found that our level didn't have an optical plummet, and so we had a little bit of trouble of stringing a plumb bob through the level and placing over the known point to check those distances. So that was XNAID, and we moved on to the next thing, which we went from corner to corner, establishing the angles as well as the distances along our property corners. While we were doing this and measuring the distances, we also set up our grid. So we used the chain to set our grid at every 25 feet. Once we had our grid set, we did use alphanumerical, like most people did, and we ran numbers down our east-west lines, and we ran letters across our north-south lines, creating organization and sequencing. We then focused on collecting our elevations at each grid point. We did paste those grid markers, and then from there, we did do a line on the exterior of the boundary, collecting outside of our boundary. Also, from each one of the grid points, if there was any major features, we paced off that and collected the elevations there. Finally, we used the rod and level to simply create those elevations. And I will pass it to Valeria for our analysis.
In terms of errors, using the compass rule adjustment, we found our linear misclosure to be 14.85 feet, along with relative precision to be 1 foot in 60 feet. Our compass was only read to the nearest 1 left greater about 2 degrees, and as seen in the image of our compass, error was also introduced in the needle and dial. Essentially, we put too much trust into our compass. Natural errors, as I'm sure we all noticed, was winds over 5 miles per hour, dust with that wind, and also the sun glare. All these reduced visibility as well. Instrumental errors, we noticed near the end of our topo that there was a crack in the casing of our automatic level, and due to time constraints, we decided to keep continuing and to be able to finish our topo. In terms of chaining errors, we had 100-foot tape, and so we had to create multiple setups. And because of our tape, we weren't sure the atmospheric corrections, so we didn't do those. And we also didn't have a local thermometer to create those. And also, as our compass is a simple compass, a lot of sand was accumulating inside that compass, creating more error in our readings. In terms of personal errors, there was definitely some in pacing interior grid. I was running a line of sight for Trevor, but at the same time, we did create more error from pacing. And also, the sun was glaring into our automatic level, creating some readability errors. In terms of examples of teamwork, even though we had to drop our stadia plan, we realized we were getting frustrated and decided to take our lunch break. And with that, we collected ourselves and were able to work as a team to continue on the next steps. We also, by creating the midpoints, we practiced our chaining and understood how well we work together, calling out whether to pull, etc., and what roles we fit best with those setups. In calculations, we office day strategized to find our final average angles. And in terms of time constraints, we were able to streamline our communication in order to complete our topographic survey in the field in about 2 hours. And as on our map, you could tell that there were multiple drainages. And we were able also to work together and complete our final draft map in approximately 2 hours as well. And now back to Trevor.
So as you can see here, we have our final map. It's also on the back wall if you're going to take a look at it. In terms of reflections, the goal of this project was to be a survey as a service to kind of a third world country, disaster zone. There's many applications where you can apply this. And the factors involved with those type of issues is, time constraints, wind, natural errors, timeline, all these things kind of add together to make it truly kind of an accurate representation of what this type of survey would be like. So in terms of how it related, it was very, very accurate in terms of the equipment we had and in terms of everything. And it kind of taught us to go back to basics, back to understanding compass, chain. I think we've handled more chains than we've ever had. So dealing with all those types of errors and figuring out what surveying was like, even as much as 100, 200 years ago, and just trying to understand where it's from gave us all really an appreciation for the kind of surveys that kind of founded America and go forward. I think I speak for all of us, though, that we'll all be very happy to see a total station again. So what would we do differently? Through the course of the project, we, as mentioned, set our property corners from a radial position from the center point. As we progressed through the project, we determined that it may have been a better idea to get to the boundary line and the point radially once and then proceed around the boundary. Hindsight's 20/20. So what we did was we approached it with the radially, and if we were to do it differently, we might change that. In terms of equipment, there are three things. One, our automatic level did not have an optical plummet, either in the form of a sighting apparatus that we could sight down or a hook to use our plumb bob off of. So that was one factor. Another one is the compass that we used, as you may have seen, did not have a sighting apparatus at all. So there was certainly an amount of error that was established through using that compass. And finally, we also had 100-foot tapes, which, and some of the distances that we were measuring, we had to break chain several times. So in terms of what we would do differently, in equipment, a little bit of terminology. What did we learn? Teamwork. Trying to understand how to work together as a team in adverse conditions. There was a multitude of factors that kind of played into this project. We were down to the wire, both cases. We're a small team. So in that situation, we really learned kind of the value of that teamwork. So, and with that, thank you. And do we have any questions?
Judges, questions?
So basically, it was distance that is really all you had to rely on, was distance intersects. So that's kind of the takeaway. You went around clockwise. Did you do some intersecting of distances to help square up some of your order of precision, would you say?
No, we did not. We measured angles and distances from each corner once we set those boundaries with the radial.
Well, so the takeaway though is that distance is really all you have because the problems with something you had no control over, which is, you were using azimuths because you wanted to go clockwise is what I think you said in the beginning. So you really were forced with just Pythagoras.
Yes, just distances.
Okay, thank you.
And
Judges, any additional questions? Anybody? Okay, students, any questions for the other team? Got one in the back over there?
Coming from a team that only had 4 people, did you think it was more of a hindrance or a good thing that you were only a team of 4?
It can be looked at in 2 different ways. In one way, we were not able to multitask at all, so we had to approach the boundary first and then the topo. If we had 2 more people, then we would have been able to perhaps have somebody start on the topo when we finished the boundary. That's one way to look at it. But in another way, at this point, I think we're all still friends, so we can approach that in the form of we're a close-knit group. So that might be an advantage. Did that answer your question?
Any other? Yeah, got one here. Yeah, go ahead.
How are you able to accurately represent your topo if y'all just paced?
So with the grid, we were able to, with the pace at 25-foot intervals. So we got as close as we could and then put the rod on it and shot it, and then paced off again at any natural features like the drainages that we ran into. We would estimate a 3-foot, 6-foot, 4-foot pace to determine where they were.
we also set up a tripod at the end of each one of our grid corners so that we could follow that line of sight.
Any other questions?
Also really quick, just to tag onto that, Valeria and Trevor were our best pacers from our classwork. They've gotten their pacing down fairly well, so we went with them to determine our pacing because we were more confident with their paces.
Anybody else? Oh, okay.
You mentioned a crack in the level casing. Did that factor in any, did that bring in any error in your elevation checks?
So as we were reading our rod we noticed that in the big gusts of wind, our level started vibrating and our crosshairs would vibrate, so we couldn't actually see the crosshairs. And so that's when we started looking more at what was going on with our level, and that's when we noticed the crack. So we think that crack was introducing or allowing the wind to get inside of it and just kind of jiggling things around. So that kind of played into our time because we had to wait for the wind to die down and let those crosshairs settle so then we could take the shot. But certainly it did introduce error because it may have put calibration out of whack on that level.
Did you test it with the fake test?
No, we did not.
At the point in which we found that error, it was 1 hour or 30 minutes left. So there was no opportunity to do a calibration.
Anybody else? Okay. Thank you very much.